Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. All right, welcome back to our next episode of Reframing Behavior with Guy Stevens. We're actually going to do this episode with Connie Persick as well, but she was unable to make it for any number of reasons, which is okay. We'll catch her again another time. But Reframing Behavior with Guy Stevens. Excited to be able to have this episode to kind of talk about. I mean, we've had you on before. So first of all, besides the people that are currently in the room we're in, the first two-time guest.
Yeah.
So you're making history.
Wow,
that's exciting. That's exciting.
Yeah, right? Like, how many times have you hosted SNL? It's like, how many times have you been on this podcast?
Just to get invited back is a good thing. So,
Yeah.
That's right. Well, we're excited that you were willing to come back. That's always a good thing too. So I'm going to kind of let Katie jump into this lead-in, kind of let everybody know why we're meeting up with you again and some of the updates that we have and that you have that we'll be talking with you about today.
Yeah, we're excited to have Guy Stevens back. If you've not listened to our previous podcast or don't know who Guy Stevens is, he runs the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint and has done an enormous amount of advocacy work within our legal system, within schools, and supporting families and educators to really reframe behavior within our educational system. He is partner with Connie Persick, who runs Supportable Solutions, who just came up with the Y Toolkit and has a very similar, has a background in SLP and has done a ton in terms of professional development, supporting school districts, again, reframing behavior and making that shift. So they have partnered together with Crisis Prevention Intervention to come out with a new professional development opportunity for school districts named Reframing Behavior, which I think is the most brilliant idea and so needed. So we're excited to have Guy back to talk a little bit about his new project. So,
Woo.
Yeah.
All right. We promised we're going to let Guy talk here in a second. Guy.
Once I start, I don't stop. So you're probably
got it.
You're doing the smart thing right now.
We'll just keep going. What we'll do is we'll just have your face up and Katie and I'll talk the whole time and we'll use you as promotional material.
I can move my lips if I need to. You know?
Yeah. Okay, cool.
That's right. Hey, can you talk a little bit about how you and Connie kind of connected for this project? Just in general, like how did you guys get together and get connected to start this project?
Sure. So, Connie and I kind of began collaborating well before this project even came into, I think, anyone's mind. We had actually met, I think, initially, Dr. Lori Desautel, of course, has a fantastic program at Butler University in Applied Educational Neuroscience, and I know you're very familiar with that program.
Yes.
Connie was in that program at one point a number of years ago, and you were asking me which cohort, and I don't remember anymore, but she was in that program. And for many years now, Dr. Lori has invited me to come and guest lecture, and it's always one of the highlights of my year is getting to come and talk to people that are part of that program. It's really an amazing program, and I won't go into a commercial for it, but the program that she runs is really fantastic. And through that, I typically will do 2 presentations for her cohorts about, who the Alliance is and our work and what we do. And Connie was in one of those cohorts that I had the opportunity to present to. And, whenever I present it to any of the cohorts that from Dr. Lori's program, I always am very deliberate about wanting to connect with people. Because what I found, and I've yet to find an exception to this, but what I found is that by and large, the people that are in that program, this Applied Educational Neuroscience program, all seem to be really passionate about, understanding the brain and the nervous system, understanding trauma-informed approaches, doing better for kids and teachers. So I always kind of deliberately say, hey, like, I'd love to connect with people from the cohort. And what tends to happen is people reach out. And they'll reach out and, we'll have conversations. And in fact, right now we have, and I don't even know the number, but we have a number of volunteers on the Alliance team who are graduates from the AEN program. Connie had been through the AEN program. And interestingly enough, Connie was working on the development of something called the Y Toolkit, which is a incredible reimagining of an FBA that doesn't sound, when Connie first told me about it, well, I have to be honest, I don't think very highly of most FBAs, So when she said I'm working at FBI, I was like, I don't know about that. And then she shared with me kind of the work that she's doing is kind of reimagining this FBA process through something she calls the Why Toolkit, which really dives into trying to understand kind of the deeper why, what's going on. So Connie was working on the development of this, and she was sending it out to a number of people that were working in this space and asking for input and ideas, and sent it to people, of course, like Lori. She sent it to me and asked me if I would look at it. Sent it to Dr. Mona Delahook, sent it to a number of folks. And what I recall, and of course, Connie's not here to correct me, so my version of the truth will be the version that I remember, and she'll later tell me that I was wrong. But what I recall is that aside from the fact that I had the opportunity to kind of meet her through one of the cohorts, she was having some conversations with other people in the space, and one of those conversations was with Dr. Mona Delahook, who I am a huge fan of Mona's work. I feel fortunate to not only think of Mona as somebody that really inspires me, but to think of her as a friend. I've had the opportunity to get to know Mona a bit over the years, and really fantastic. And if you don't know who Mona is, Google it and Google Beyond Behaviors, because it's a fantastic book. But as I recall, Connie was having a conversation with Mona and kind of talking about like other people to connect with. And somehow Mona recommended that Connie connect with me. And somehow we had already, kind of connected. And then that kind of started some more conversations. So our initial kind of, I guess, collaborative effort started around, she asked if I would review the Why Toolkit. I began looking at that, offering some input. And ultimately, it's funny because I run a very, very small nonprofit. So I'm not surrounded by lots of people every day, but somehow, Connie has kind of turned into like my work friend as well. So we're always texting and talking to each other. And we started collaborating on a number of things. She started writing some articles for the Alliance. In fact, one of our most popular articles to date was an article that she wrote about rewards. It was called The Dark Side of Rewards, and really dives into a lot of the research underneath why rewards, while they sound like a good idea, often are really not something that works. So we've had the opportunity over time to collaborate on a lot of different things. I can go into a little bit more deeply how the collaboration with CPI started, because that's a really interesting story. But once I began some collaboration with CPI, which, as you probably know, CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, is the largest training provider of de-escalation and crisis management in the country. And, we can talk about this in a minute, but you're probably already scratching your head like, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, Crisis Prevention Institute, they teach restraint. Why are these two together? And we can go down that rabbit hole. But what I'll tell you is that I'd started some collaboration with CPI. And, I'd started a series of conversations about this idea for a new program. And I was at an event in Wisconsin presenting. Connie was presenting. And I was also meeting Susan Driscoll there, the president of CPI. And I'd been telling Susan about Connie, like, this is somebody I would love to bring into this work that we're doing. And anyway, through a number of conversations, and then subsequently, Connie and I got involved as both being kind of the content contributors and authors of a lot of the program that was developed. That's where that collaboration really began. But we've been kind of working together on a lot of things over the course of a couple of years. And I'm always really eager to collaborate with anyone that's kind of in this like-minded space and area, because I think there's so much power in that. So, Connie has certainly been one of my, I think, we're even talking about other projects that we can work on together. Somebody that I'm very aligned with in terms of ideology, but, somebody that brings a tremendous amount to the table in terms of, kind of those things that are important to me. I know that we're kind of in the same, kind of mental space here in terms of like these changes that need to occur. I now have kind of like formalized like these 5 principles that I think are really critical, which are, trauma-informed, neuroscience aligned, neurodiversity affirming, relationship driven, and collaborative. And she's one of these human beings that I'm really, I think, very, very aligned with. And where I'm not aligned, I'm usually learning something from her. So that's the beauty of collaboration, is that not only, can you bring your own background and experience, but for me, it's always this opportunity to learn from people that have different experiences and are sometimes far smarter than I am.
Yeah. I mean, that's the key, right? Find people that know more than you.
That's right. That's
what I try to do all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That's kind of how Justin and I got together. I always think, gosh, he's so much smarter than me. So talk to us a little bit about, because I think that was my first instinct about you partnering with CPI. What an unusual collaboration as someone who's been a CPI trainer, works in a school, sure. Right? They predominantly are known for restraint, right? That's restraint training for mostly schools. So how did the guy who's running the alliance against this partner with the largest restraint training company in the country? So how did that come together for you guys?
Sure. And that's a really, I think it's an important story because, what I'll tell you is of course, as we said, CPI, and often you hear people refer to them as the restraint company. Yeah. I'll share with you later that Susan Driscoll, who's now the president of CPI, she wants to change that. That's not what she wants CPI to be known for. And I think that we're doing some work in that space to hopefully do that. But our collaboration actually started, and I'll just share with you my very first experience with CPI. So yours was as an instructor. My very first experience with CPI was not a pleasant one. It was my son being physically restrained and secluded. It was my son being traumatized in a school. The staff that were working with my son were trained in CPI. And I remember staff holding up their CPI training card and saying, "We're trained in safe restraint and seclusion from CPI." Now, I see you smile, and that smile is probably, there's two problems with that statement that I just made. One, CPI doesn't teach seclusion. Two, there's really no such thing as a safe restraint. You can be trained and that can reduce the risk, but there's always risk to restraint. So my very first exposure to CPI was not a pleasant one. Now, as I formed the alliance, of course, I talked about a lot of things. And I did talk openly about concerns I had around the training industry, concerns I had around the training that was being conducted in schools, because I had seen firsthand what that looks like when it goes wrong. And one of the concerns that I had was that some of the models of training sometimes weren't leading to training that was done with fidelity. So very often what was being taught kind of here at the level of CPI and what ended up in the schools were quite different. Somebody might have gone to a train the trainer program for 4 days and gotten a deep dive and then come back and had 3 or 4 hours to train. And very often what happened is the physical skills would be emphasized and a lot of the other things would be de-emphasized. So my first experience with CPI was not necessarily one where I was like, oh, gosh, this is somebody I want to work with. And again, I shared some of those thoughts publicly, but I mean, I wasn't picking on anyone in particular about that, but there are concerns as a whole. Turns out a few years ago, and my timeline, I don't have everything in front of me right now, but it was probably 3 or so years ago. I got an email from Susan Driscoll. Susan Driscoll is the president of CPI. Susan's email was something along the effect of, hey, I've seen the work you've been doing, would really love to connect with you and learn more about your work. And I thought, well, gee, that's interesting. CPI wants to have a conversation with me. Should I be afraid? And it turns out we scheduled a meeting. We had a conversation. I've always been of the mindset of have a conversation with anyone, even if you're not necessarily aligned, because that sometimes is where there's a really powerful ability to change things. And so I went into that conversation, honestly, pretty skeptical of where that might go. Susan was very complimentary of our work, said some very positive things. I've been diving in, watching our podcast and looking at the interviews that we were doing and, was inspired by what we were doing. I, again, was pretty skeptical. Our conversation kind of continued. And one of the, I guess the main outcome of that conversation is that in somewhat a casual way, Susan said, hey, if you ever want to see our training, let me know. And I said, I'd love to. I'm an advocate. I'd love to see your training. And she arranged for me to go take their nonviolent crisis intervention training, second edition. I did that in Baltimore. I went to the full, train the trainer program and completed it. Not because I wanted to learn how to use restraint, not because I planned to apply it, but I wanted to know what they were doing. And I completed that training and I had a lot of notes. And I reached back out to Susan and said, I took the training. If you're interested in my feedback, I'd be happy to share it. And if you're not, I understand. That's fine too. And she's like, of course. And I said, okay, great. So we had a conversation. I shared with Susan really pretty honestly my concerns. I provided a pretty long list of feedback, but I shared with her primarily concerns about the fact that there was very little, if any, neuroscience in the training. There was really not much in the way of being trauma informed. In fact, CPI at the time had a separate module for being trauma informed. It was not integrated into their nonviolent crisis intervention training. It was not person centered. Their decision making matrix looked at risk and likelihood, but didn't consider the risk of actually using a physical restraint on someone. Number of things that I thought were troubling. And one final thing I shared with her was that when I took my course, during the course, we moved from de-escalation skills into physical skills. And at some point during that transition, somebody stood up in the corner and was like, all right, let's go kick some now. And I'll leave out the colorful language. But their comment was probably intended in good fun, but restraint is not something to take lightly. When you put hands on an individual to restrain them, they will likely go into fight or flight response. There is a tremendous risk to the children and the adults involved. It is something that we have a responsibility to really take seriously. And I shared that with Susan and said, look, CPI is not responsible, obviously, for what he said. They should address it. But beyond that, I believe there's a responsibility to make people aware of how much impact this kind of training can have and how it can lead to trauma. So we had that conversation. That was kind of the end. And, period. I didn't really expect anything more to come of it. I didn't really have high expectations that they would be, listening and thinking, oh, this guy from the Alliance, they want us to make some changes here. I didn't think any of that was going to happen. A few months later, I got a phone call from a gentleman who I had actually previously connected with, who worked at CPI, and I connected with him under the context of when my son was being restrained and secluded. I began to ask CPI questions. This is the person, I think it was like a vice president of communications, something like that. He reached back out to me, and as I asked these questions of him, he responded in truthful and honest ways about what CPI was and what they weren't. What I quickly learned is that what my school was saying and what CPI trained were not necessarily one and the same. So this person reached out to me kind of out of the blue and said, hey, he had actually retired. And the irony is he had retired, but then was helping out on a special project. He had this idea around providing CPI training for free to attorneys, advocates, and parents so that they would know what the training was and what it wasn't, as a way to help ensure fidelity and accountability. And he was kind of pitching to me this idea like, hey, do you want to collaborate around that? Maybe advocates and we had what began a series of conversations. My initial take to, do you want to collaborate, was no. You're a crisis prevention training company that teaches restraint. I'm trying to end the use of seclusion, reduce the use of restraint. I didn't necessarily see it. But over the course of a series of conversations, because we kept having conversations, I realized that we shared concerns. We shared some ideas. I began to get to know this individual better. And in fact, not only had he retired, he was moving down to Florida, and he and his wife were planning to do some work advocating for kids. His wife had actually been an occupational therapist for her career, did a lot of work with autistic children, had a conversation with her, realized like, hey, she's one of my people. Like, I'm aligned with her. Went back and said, hey, Marvin, your wife, like she's increased your credibility with me. Let's talk some more. So this series of conversations led to a point where we talked more about the potential of collaboration. And I was still pretty resistant. And I said to him at one point, I said, look, we're trying to end seclusion, reduce restraint. I said, if CPI, let's just say hypothetically, CPI were willing to come out in a press release and say, we are aligned with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in eliminating seclusion and reducing restraint, I said, that would be a really good starting foundation for a relationship or partnership. And Marvin's like, okay. He went back to Susan Driscoll and had a conversation. And Susan said, sure, we'll do that. And in fact, I guess it was about 2 years ago, they put out a press release to that effect. We entered into a partnership with shared goals of eliminating seclusion and reducing restraint. Subsequently, not only have we worked in those areas, Susan Driscoll has actually testified on bills to eliminate seclusion and reduce the use of restraint. And in fact, it makes good sense. It didn't make sense to me initially, but truth be told, it's in everyone's best interest if we can eliminate seclusion and reduce restraint. Anytime you can avoid going hands-on with a kid, we should. And CPI kind of realized that as well. But that opened the door, and that opened the door for what would then lay the foundation for reframing behavior. We had some pretty candid conversations in the beginning, and I shared ideas and I shared thoughts and pretty candidly. I said, Crisis Prevention Institute, I said, honestly, you're not doing the prevention work. De-escalation and physical skills, those are reactive. Those are a crisis has begun. I said, if we really wanted to change things, we need to move upstream. We need to figure out why is a crisis happening in the first place and what can we do to avoid that? So that set the stage for what would come next. And what came next were, one, I started talking really about the things I was passionate about. Started talking about trauma, started talking about the brain. I'm of the mindset, and I know both of you are probably very aligned with this. And, as I look at your shirt there, I know you're aligned with this. I'm a big believer that like a little bit of brain science goes a long way in seeing behavior differently. And when you see behavior differently, you have this opportunity to respond differently. So I'm of this mindset that, when you understand behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system, and you understand that not all behavior is intentional, when you begin to understand the stress response, all these things, it changes everything. So I talked, as I sometimes do, excitedly at length about kind of neuroscience and trauma. And Susan then asked me if I would do a presentation for CPI, a team at CPI. And I said, sure, I'll do that. She asked me if I'd present something on kind of what I was saying, kind of like this foundational brain science. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but what I'm good at, and I do have a science background, but what I'm good at is taking something complicated and trying to simplify it so that we can communicate it clearly. And I agreed to that. And I, in fact, ended up doing a, hour and a half presentation to a team at CPI, where I not only presented the brain science, I actually, kind of took that opportunity a little further and shared with CPI, like a couple of things like, this is where I think you are, and this is where I think you need to move. I think that, and here I am just an advocate, they don't need to listen to me. But I shared some of my thoughts, and ultimately that led to what would become the seeds for Reframing Behavior, the new program that we've developed together. But we had this kind of, and it started out with just Susan and I. I remember meeting at at one point, kind of in, I think it was in Delaware. We had a meeting and we talked about I started sharing like all these things that excite me about, Mono's work and the polyvagal theory and Lori's work and, all these things that are out there and how we can know better. That became then the seed for this idea that would then grow into developing a new program.
Yeah, that's what a crazy story ultimately, like how many connections there are and how many, just the road, right? The road of a relationship and the process of a relationship between, I guess, organizations, sure, but between people is really what it is.
Well, and the people part's really important. So, one of the things that, I'll tell you is that, for me, it was really important. So this idea of collaborating with CPI, again, like I was not really very open to that, but through relationships and realizing when I first realized that Marvin, who's the person I had been having these conversations with, and then his wife, Amy, who actually now is a volunteer on the Alliance, helps us bring on our volunteers, but then had the opportunity to begin to get to know Susan better. What was important to me was not just this idea of like collaborating, but like knowing that I'm working with people that want to do something for the right reason. Because at the end of the day, for me, this is not about business or expanding your customer base or any of that. It's about how do we influence a change in the world that's going to make the world a better place. And I got to develop those relationships with both Susan, and Marvin that helped to lay the foundation. And I think if I didn't think that these were people that wanted to do this I don't think it would ever move forward. That was important.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important thing for people to hear and understand too. I think is how, I don't know, how clinical things can seem sometimes. I guess, I don't know, that's business oriented. That's just business, things like that. There's those kind of mindsets we kind of have sometimes, but really so much just comes back down to relationships and the people that we're working with. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as people go throughout anything they're doing throughout their lives, is that relationships are what matter in everything. That's what really matters. Okay, so reframing behavior. So what can folks expect from this that's a little bit different from other programs?
So when we started, again, the idea of reframing behavior was, how do we go upstream? I share a quote probably on 90% of my presentations, which is a quote from Desmond Tutu, which says, rather than pulling people out of the river, how do we go upstream and figure out why they're falling in? And to me, going upstream is where we need to go. So, in my goals of, reducing restraint, eliminating seclusion, and even beyond that, like, reducing punitive and exclusionary discipline in general, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all of these things, we need to go upstream and figure out why kids are having a hard time, why they're not able to meet the expectation, what is it that's getting in the way? And so for me, this is really about an upstream program. As we began to put it together, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to create a program that would bring, so the three of us and many of your listeners are probably deep in this journey of understanding trauma, deep in this journey of understanding behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system, deep in this journey of doing things differently. But what I'll tell you is, and my number may not be exact here, but there's roughly 14,000 school districts across the nation. Many of these school districts have not even begun considering a journey into trauma-informed practices or neuroscience or any of these things. And of course, there are some great programs out there today. And I'll say, in full transparency, like, I support any and all of this work, meaning that I want people to do whatever program helps them to bring about change wherever they are and helps them. I never look at this through a lens of like, oh, this is the way you have to go. Whatever may be working for you. And there's a lot of different approaches out there. Lori's program in applied educational neurosciences, Mona's work. There's so much out there. Dr. Bruce Perry's, work, support all of that. But what we know is there's a tremendous need out there, and there are many places where they've not even begun. So part of the goal of reframing behavior is, how do we bring the neuroscience of behavior more into mainstream schools? How can we bring that into more schools around the country? Not just schools that happen to be fortunate enough to have a graduate of the applied educational neuroscience program, right? Not just schools where there's a principal that participated in a training that really shifted everything, but again, this vast majority of schools, and this is where the relationship with CPI really began to make a lot of sense. But the program itself is reframing behavior. So what do we mean by reframing behavior? We mean looking at behavior differently. Looking at behavior differently how? Well, looking at behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system. Much of what we do today in both education and in homes are behavioral ideas and approaches really from a century ago. There's still a tremendous belief system around operant conditioning, reward and consequence. There's a tremendous body of belief around all behavior being intentional, that when kids are doing things, they're doing things because they've made bad choices. And as you begin to dive into the brain and the nervous system, of course, you guys are well beyond the beginning to dive in place, but as people begin to dive into that, I'm a huge believer that when you see that, when you begin to understand, like, hey, not all behavior is intentional. There's these bottom or body up behaviors, and there's these top down behaviors. And this is how brain development works. Our brain development works in such a way that our prefrontal cortex, the thinking, logical, rational part of our brain, develops last. Does a 5-year-old have that same ability? No, they don't. So when you begin to see human behavior through that lens, and just even acknowledging that not all behavior is intentional, understanding the stress response system, to me, that changes everything. So reframing behavior is really about, how do we reframe behavior by, rather than looking at it through that lens of intent, of understanding that much of the behavior that we're seeing is stress behavior, is coming from our brain and our nervous system as a response. So reframing behavior is about seeing something differently, seeing behavior differently. I have a friend and colleague, and again, kind of back in that boat of like people doing amazing work, Dr. Stuart Shanker, who wrote a fantastic book called Self-Reg, but has done a tremendous amount of work through an organization called the Merit Center. He has a quote that I've always loved, which is, when you see a child differently, you see a different child. I've got it hanging a poster outside of my office. When we see people differently, we see different people. And that's what reframing is about. It's about how do we see this through a different lens. And then once you see something differently, you can become, and to me, this foundational brain science, that's the foundation of this. It begins with kind of, reframing kind of your ideas around behavior, which is, kind of this idea of seeing things through that brain and nervous system perspective. But then it's a matter of like, how do you become aware of your own brain and nervous system? I'm a big advocate, and I think probably both of you are too, that this work begins with us, like the adults. These are not just things we learn and do to kids differently. Like, we have to embody the work that we begin to dive into. We have to understand the effects of our own nervous system, what anchors us, what helps us if we're having a hard time, how to give ourselves grace when we become dysregulated, what we can do to help keep ourselves regulated. Because, of course, at the heart of this, it requires a regulated adult to help a child who's having a difficult time. So we kind of go through this journey of like, learning about the brain science, becoming aware of your own brain and body, reframing your actions. Like, what are things that you can do now that you have this awareness and now that you see behavior differently? What are things that you can do? And there's so much here in terms of things that you can do as an educator. I mean, a lot of it starts with simple things like being curious, asking questions, kind of moving your mindset in a different direction. And of course, we go into this kind of awareness, phase. We go into this actions phase, and we talk a lot about relationships, because the relationships are really the key to so much of this. So reframing behavior is all about seeing behavior differently, then being equipped to, take actions to respond differently and to understand your own stress response system, and ultimately create environments where you're going to be able to better support kids. And of course, what do we know about the human brain? Well, if we want to teach kids and we don't start with regulation, we're not going to teach. When we're dysregulated, our thinking, logical, rational brain is not there and available. So reframing behavior is all about seeing things differently, seeing ourselves differently, responding differently. And it's a really interesting program. So in CPI terms, it's something entirely different than anything they've done, not only because it's so kind of upstream, but it's an entirely different model. One of the things that's really important to me about this training, it's not kind of this one and done model. It's not, okay, go off, you had your day of professional development. All right, go do it all. I mean, we can't dump a year's worth of brain science on somebody and then expect them to just become, experts in all of this and be able to do it. This program is being sold as a subscription. And the idea with the subscription model that they're putting out there with this is that when a school or district subscribes to this, and let's take a school as an example, when a school subscribes to reframing behavior, the intent is that we want to see everyone in the school receive training in reframing behavior. And when I say everyone, I don't just mean teachers and paraprofessionals, and I mean bus drivers, cafeteria workers, front office staff. The incident that begins on the bus that boils over into the cafeteria that turns up in the classroom, like, if we can help all staff to see behavior differently. I mean, I think about stories. Ginger Healy shares one of like when she was young and dysregulated, and it was a cafeteria worker that kind of saw her in that moment and helped her to regulate. These kinds of things really can make a big difference. So this is a whole school model. And the idea here is it starts with an initial training. So that can be done fully in person. There's a blended model where we've got an online component and an in-person component. But that initial training is just the beginning. In addition to the initial training, there's support for, depending on how a school is set up, but for additional learning. So we've actually created activities and things to do within PLCs. So if you have a professional learning community in your school, there are activities to be done throughout the year in that PLC. If you do it at staff meetings, great. You can use some of these activities in staff meetings. We also constructed this learning library, which, again, if I were to take people like you, the things that we're focused on initially are probably like, oh yeah, well, we're experts on all of that. And we wanted to have a place where we could have deeper dives. So we've got this learning library. In the learning library, there's things like, some short book overviews of books that you might want to dive into deeper, and questions that you might use for doing a book study if you wanted to. There's videos of kind of like what good looks like. What do these things actually look like in practice? So it really is kind of this whole school program. You think of CPI and you think of, you often think of tier 2, tier 3 kids, right? So if we look at that model, it's the kids that are having a hard time. This is for everybody. And one of the things that I'm really hopeful about that is, and I could probably pose this to you as a question, but how many kids might we better support and avoid moving into more restrictive settings or needing higher levels of support if we appropriately supported them kind of at the base here? And that's what this is about. This is about like offering this as a whole school program, really with the idea of how do we change kind of the culture and the practices throughout the fabric of the organization. And again, the intent being as a subscription that there's going to be more content that's developed and added to this over time. So that's the idea of it. The idea is really, in a sentence, it's how do we bring the neuroscience of human behavior to mainstream schools and help to equip all school staff to better support themselves and the students that they serve.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's is appealing about that to me, everything you just described, is one of the things, and you mentioned earlier, this idea of changing how we see as adults, right? And I think that's one of the things that's really hard. I've said this before on the podcast many times, but about training is that in education, so many teachers are used to being trained in a way where they go to something 2, 3, 4 times, maybe a long training on an academic thing would be like a week long, right? Potentially. And you go to this training, you get trained in whatever it might be, math, reading, how to teach kids how to read, whatever it might be. And then you follow those steps and that's it. And this is, when you look at behavior, when you look at mental health issue, all the things, right? When you look at all this relational side of teaching beyond the academics, it requires a change in how we see. And that's not something that happens over the course of just a couple of days or a couple of trainings. And what you're describing as a subscription, one of the nice things about that is people tend to fall off, right? We see people that get excited about these ideas and they'll be excited and they'll be in, but then when they run into opposition or when they run into a frustrating moment with a student and the first few things they try doesn't work, or when they run into opposition from another staff member or whatever it might be, like they want to kind of bail, and there's not a lot of support or continuing education on how to approach things next, or how to move the next step, or how to see the next thing a little differently, or how to introspectively see what they need to see about themselves a little differently. And with a subscription kind of situation that you're talking about, hopefully those things you continue to grow deeper into it instead of a one-off. And then you're just hoping that it took enough to change how you saw. And the reality is almost exclusively that's not enough. The individual one-off professional developments just doesn't cut it. So it's the ongoing training and the ongoing support, I think, that makes such a difference. So I love hearing that about how this is set up.
Yeah, and go ahead, guys.
I was just going to say, just to add to that real quickly. I mean, part of what you said. So if you're in education right now, like you've seen it all, you've had enough initiatives. Okay, reframe. We don't need another initiative here. We don't need another thing that we're going to do. We do all of these other things. Reframing behavior intentionally was designed to be able to work with other things that you might be doing, not to replace them, not to be this huge initiative, but rather to bring about this change. But to me, the really big seed of change here that I think has so much power is that mindset. Okay. Because the training, the skills, the things that you learn, those are all great. Those are easy to fall off. But if you can change somebody's mindset, if the main success that we saw in coming in with this program was for people to suddenly see behavior differently, like that would be a huge success. So I mean, to me, that's something I'm really hopeful about, because I really do believe, and you guys are both evidence of this as well, right? Like when you see these things differently, when you look through a different lens, that's some of the most important work that needs to be done. And for many, there's such an opportunity to do that, and we've got the knowledge. So that's one of the things I'm really hopeful about. But you're right, and the program being a subscription, the obligation then that follows this for CPI is to continue to develop more depth, more knowledge, more ability to support schools, and of course we're working with a professor at a university and looking for ways to kind of like continue to measure, the outcomes and the effectiveness and what we can do to better support schools. But it's a journey. This is not just okay, here's your training. Go do things differently. No, and for you to think, oh gosh, if only I'd known this, right? This is really about changing that mindset. And I'm sorry, Katie, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, you're good. I was just saying a couple really critical things you mentioned that I think we would definitely support and believe in as well, is that you have to train the entire school, right? The culture and climate. Because if people don't understand what you're doing, then the support staff are looking at you like, oh, they're not handling that, or why are they approaching that way? And then it starts being like a toxic culture and climate, right? Then you have nobody bought in to really shifting the mindset of behavior. So it is really important that you train. I would agree with you, bus drivers, to paraprofessionals, secretary, gen ed teachers, special education teachers, you name it. Everyone needs to be trained this is the fabric of our culture this is what we believe about kids. So I think that is so important. And I also think that you mentioned the PLC groups. I am such an advocate for those. I think it is the biggest professional development opportunity. It's educator SEL. We talked about the educator state of mind and that part. And it just, what a neat idea that's already set up. So if you're not sure how to start a PLC or run a PLC, this program has it built in, and it's a made and ready staff meeting for you. Or those small groups, right? It's there.
And as part of this training, CPI trains a facilitator at your school. So CPI actually trains the facilitator. If that facilitator leaves your school, they'll train another facilitator at your school. But they actually train the facilitator who helps to facilitate the training and helps to put things in place. So, I mean, that's part of this subscription. And the other thing I'll tell you, and I'm not the numbers guy, but what I will tell you is that the cost for this is extremely affordable, at least in my opinion. You probably have an idea. I mean, to send one person off to get full training and certification in like nonviolent, it's around $3,000, I think. You can get a whole school subscription for less than it costs to train one person in, their typical program. So, and I think they're doing that intentionally. I think they're really trying to kind of move into a new direction and bring in, new opportunities in schools that maybe aren't schools that have worked with CPI before. And I think it's a great benefit to schools because, you can get a whole district in the program without, spending a fortune, which I think is really important.
Yeah. And the amount of money saved, I think that's a hard part to quantify, but how much money ends up being saved in the end once down the road, once everybody is in this training and is seeing differently the expenses that would go towards probably behavior management, I guess is how you would describe that aren't there now because we're catching stuff upstream. Right now, all of a sudden, we're saving time, we're saving money, and that's hard to calculate how much is being saved.
And reducing staff turnover, increasing staff satisfaction, like the potential. And again, you two is people that live and breathe and have implemented lots of things that are very much aligned with what we're doing here. I mean, you've seen those kinds of changes happen probably from your own experience. And I mean, I'm a firm believer and have been for some time, like the same things that we do to improve the outcomes for kids will improve the outcomes for teachers and staff. And you see that. You see where like by changing that culture, by changing the view, by going upstream, by preventing that big behavior, you're going to make a positive change in the entire school.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. A couple things as we get ready to wrap up. One, I want you to be able to describe or let people know if they are interested in getting started specifically with this, what should they do? And then the second, be thinking, I don't know if you remember this from last time because you've been here before, as we said, but we'll ask you what's one thing that you want people to walk away knowing too. But let people know if they're interested in this. How do they go about getting signed up? How do they go about finding more information about reframing behavior?
Sure. So this is a pretty major initiative from Crisis Prevention Institute. So if you go to their website, you can find information on reframing behavior. If you're working at a school or a district, I mean, what I would encourage you to do is share this with others, within your school or within your district. If you work within a district, send the website to people that might, be on the radar of looking into programming. If you're a parent, like send this to your child's school, make them aware of the program. But there's a great, presence on the CPI website, and you can fill out a form and get more information. There's a great little video intro there to it as well that kind of gives you an idea of what this program is all about. It's just a real short thing. But that's a great step. If you go to the Alliance website right now, I think our main story right now is a short article about reframing behavior, and it goes into some of the origin that I talked about, like how this all came to be. So yeah, you can go there. As I said, we kind of did this in partnership with CPI, and we're really excited about the opportunity to get it out there. And from my understanding, we just officially made the program available in June. But there are already many schools that have signed up, and they have contracts that are going out now for schools that are beginning to sign up for the program. And so anyway, yeah, you can go there to learn more. People can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk to them as well. We did a lot before we got to the point where it was actually available, where and this is an important point to make, I guess, that we didn't hit on here. As part of the process of developing this, we had what we termed as a voice of the customer panel. Really what that was a panel of educators, administrators, people that oversaw like bus drivers, like a really broad group of people that we wanted to get input from. And we got input from a lot of educators that are out there working actively in schools with kids. And it was a great opportunity. So, I mean, this isn't just like, four of us going into a cave and coming out with something.
Sure.
It's based on a lot of strong, solid foundation of work, and had a lot of input from educators, which is, I think, always really important. So that's where you can go find out more. Go to CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, go to the Alliance website as well, and you can, find out more information there.
Excellent. All right, Katie, I'm going to ask you first. What would thing you want people to walk away with?
Okay, well, here's my little spiel, and I'd love to have Guy and Connie back on. Maybe this is episode 50, Guy. Have you back on to talk about, I did a presentation for a group of directors of special education in Ohio, right? And I had a lot of BCBAs reach out to me afterwards that had been hired and contracted by districts. I think districts are trying to find something to manage the behavior post-COVID, right? I think it's critically important that we start looking at the tier one, the ground up approach that Guy's talking about. If you want to shift behavior, it's building the neuroscience education. It is developing all of your staff, all of your people, having people walk alongside each other, support those PLC groups, put staff meeting resources around it, because people will pick it up at different times, and you need to, this is a wraparound program of service. I think that the money you will save to do this for districts and the shift and the benefits you will see as the output of behavior will tremendously be beneficial. And then we got to stop thinking that we're just going to hire this one person and they're going to come in and they're going to change a district of 8,000 kids' behavior, right? That's crazy. We got to start looking at this differently. And I think this is where we keep on, I see districts attempting it, but really failing because they're putting it all on the backs of one person. And that person's coming in with usually an ABA background, and that we know that doesn't support kids with trauma-based behaviors. So I really think what you guys have going on is great. I would love to continue to support this. And I think you guys are definitely moving in the right direction in terms of how do we make systematic district level shifts. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, and this is about, it is about shifting. And anytime you're trying to shift, you're pushing on some things, and there's things that people may have always done before. There's approaches that people have always had, but we have more knowledge today about the brain and the nervous system and behavior than we've had at any point in time. And at some point it's time to shift that. But again, I mean, one of the things that, again, when I kind of reflecting on all of this, the idea of collaborating with CPI, as I mentioned, like it was not instantly like obvious to me, but now that we've done it, I've realized like what a tremendous opportunity this is. There are CPI, because they have this existing network, because they have a lot of customers, because they have a reputation. I mean, there are a lot of places that have used them for their crisis training that have had really great, support and experiences from them. There's an opportunity to get this into schools that let's say hypothetically, the three of us got together and we developed this really awesome training, right? there are schools out there that are never going to come knocking on our door because, we're kind of out there on this little fringe of like, maybe a little bit heading in a different direction. CPI, on the other hand, has an opportunity to get this into schools and places that would not be receptive to, some of the others that we may know and work with. So, I mean, it's a really great opportunity to get into places and work with people who might not instantly think, Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Yeah, we want to bring them on to help us with behavior, or so I think there's a good opportunity there, going to kind of what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Guy. If there's one thing you've said a lot of great things. If there's one snippet that you want people to walk away remembering from this episode, what might that be?
Well, I knew that was coming. I knew it was coming, and it still becomes hard. I think the one snippet is really, it really is in the vein of that. When we see each other differently, when we see behavior differently, when we see a kid differently, we can see them and see an entirely different person. I mean, it's that sort Schenker quote, right? I mean, it's this idea that you see a kid differently, you see a different kid. To me, the shift in mindset, reframing behavior, seeing it differently holds so much potential. And I'm really optimistic. I'm optimistic. And again, there's so much else out there. And, at the end of the day, I don't care what somebody does to help them get on this journey and make a change, not only for themselves, but for the kids that they work with. But I'm hopeful that this will be part of that solution in the greater context of things.
Yeah, that's so good. I have nothing because you said the one I was going to say. I mean, that's exactly it, Guy. I think the way we see has to shift, and that's not easy to shift in people. It takes a long time for us as adults to change how we see things. So you have to be supportive. If you're out there and you're in a school district and you're thinking like, but all of these people aren't changing, man, it is a marathon. Stick with it, stay steady, and stay supportive of people that are having a little slower time shifting how they see. Because again, those people aren't bad, evil people, right? They're people that it's just taking them longer to shift how they see and to understand it. And that's taking them longer to see or shift how they see themselves and all those things.
Re-education almost, right? Re-education.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I mean, it really is, though. I mean,
yeah.
We've learned certain things that, now we know aren't true. And we've gotten behind those practices. We've and when they don't work, we do more of them. As Katie mentioned earlier, it's like, the common ideology not only is very kind of behaviorally based, but kind of looks at the kid as the one that all of it's on. And it's not. There's a good bit of it on us as the adults, and changing the adult mindset, that's where it all begins. And that's where we have the greatest opportunity for change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Guy, thanks for being on. I'm going to have Katie end our episode.
You did this to me last time.
I did. I know. I like putting you on the spot sometimes.
All right. Well, please, if you like our episode, please like, subscribe, follow us. Guy has a YouTube channel, Facebook page. He also has a podcast. So check all those things out. There's opportunities on his website to get involved with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. So definitely check that out and see how you can support your school district. I think the most important thing is that we are making steps in the right direction, and let's continue to go out there and do the work.
Yeah, let's go do it.
Let's go do it.
Thanks, Guy.
Thanks.
Hey, everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.